Dr. Reyes, thank you so much for talking to me today about housing and homeownership in Mexico. I'm excited about this conversation. It's a topic that I've studied a lot too, and I've enjoyed to read your work on it. So yeah, you're a professor at UC Irvine?
Right. Yeah, assistant, second year.
Second year, okay. I thought you'd been there longer, but time has been so changing in the in the pandemic. All right, so let's talk about home ownership policies in Mexico. And I wanted to start off, I love the title of one of your papers is Mexico's Housing Paradox, which is a very provocative title. Can you tell me what is Mexico's housing paradox?
Right, so at very early stages when I was just starting to conceive of the project, it was a really simple sort of just contraposition of two things, right? The fact that on the one hand, we've continued to struggle with housing shortages, as they're officially called, which mainly refers to people that live in overcrowding conditions or that live in really precarious housing. Mm-hmm. And I mean, on top of that, I also look at many other issues in terms of housing access and what I think here in the US we call access to opportunity. And on the other hand, we began to see the phenomenon, and this was really new for us in 2010 when the census came out, and we were a little bit shocked by the amount of vacant housing units recorded in the country. And so, unfortunately, we don't have a lot of data on that. The count was 5 million, and so that's about 14% of the housing stock in Mexico back then. The only record that we had before that was 2005, and then the census methodology changed, and we didn't get information really for 2015. So it's a hard sort of discrepancy to study, but that's how it started. Mm-hmm. As I've theorized a little bit more about it, I have heard sort of the comment that it's not really such a novel idea, that in a sense, it sort of makes sense that housing financialization processes would lead to both precarity in terms of housing, but also to the issues such as housing vacancy, which I can talk a little bit more about as to why I do think that they've become a problem in some areas in Mexico.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, that has become a big thing in LA too, right? With this vacancy report saying there's all these vacant houses and all these people living on the streets, and like, how can that exist? But I think the Mexico policies and the situation there is quite different from the US. Maybe can you talk a little bit about the policies that led to this huge production of new houses?
Right. Yeah, and I do think that you're right. There's important differences. On the other hand, I do see, I think we've always tried to borrow some aspects of US policy in many different areas. And I do think that this was a little bit the case, particularly with securitization strategies and sort of subprime lending. Mm-hmm. And so what happened, and I mean, I don't know how long to go back to, but really with a lot of the structural adjustment that we experienced along with other Latin American countries in the 80s and 90s came a set of reforms that really shifted a lot of economic arenas, but with regards to housing, what was aimed was for credit liberalization and mortgage expansion. Mm-hmm. On the one hand, but also to transfer sort of to for the government to step away from housing production more directly, like they had done. I mean, outsourcing, contracting, of course, but with a little bit more oversight and decision to the private sector. Mm-hmm. But with a lot of financial support, of course. And so that led to the development of mass peri-urban housing developments in in the fringes of Mexican cities, where land was very cheap, and also that it had begun to be privatized. So what we call ejidos, or communal rural lands, it's much of the land that has actually been developed. And so other Latin American countries have followed similar paths. So arguably Chile perhaps started a little bit earlier than Brazil, borrowed a lot of aspects, particularly I would say in terms of development. But in terms of financing, I think Mexico, it's pretty unique. I think only Argentina more recently with Macri has sort of established similar lending conditions. And so this is one of the things that I'm most critical of, because the subprime lending schemes, like I think a lot of the schemes were really formulated to protect lenders and not borrowers. And so we see a lot of borrowers and that ended up paying like 5-6 times the price of their housing, because how these mortgages were adjusted to inflation or minimum salaries. And also, I don't know how much into detail you want me to go into that, but that's,
let's talk a little bit about who's issuing the mortgages. And so you mentioned the like 80s and 90s was this big period of kind of neoliberalism and privatization in Mexico, where banks were privatized and different sectors of the economy that had been run by the government more directly were getting privatized. So there's this big agency called Infonavit, which is like the national fund for workers' housing. So maybe tell us a little bit about kind of what Infonavit was like before and then how it changed afterwards.
Right. So Infonavit started in the late 70s with the aim. So it's always been complicated. So on the one hand, we have the constitutional right to housing in the Mexican context, but on the other hand, Infonavit has always only served private and formal employees. So, and we know that in Mexico, we have a huge segment of our population working in the informal economy. So in that regards, it's always left out a very significant portion of the population. Although its original sort of mandate was to secure that right to housing, in theory. And there were a lot of issues, sometimes in terms of clientelism, and so it was definitely not a perfect system. And a lot of the reforms also tried to sort of make it a little bit more independent, and really just mostly rather than a housing institute, I would say a mortgage and financial institution, right? And especially in the 2000s, I would say that a lot of the direction of the institute was handed into sort of financiers and bankers. And so that was a lot of the approach that was taken in terms of making, like, streamlining processes, making it sort of a sustainable institute financially, right? And so that, in a sense, conflicts with sort of securing the right to housing, I would argue. So that
issue is so interesting, because I think that really Infonavit was always kind of, it wasn't a government agency, right? As this quasi-independent tripartite, like its board is representatives of the private sector, representatives of the government, and representatives of the unions, which in Mexico had been really strong and like big power players in the economy and in the government. So it was not like a government agency saying we're going to provide the right to housing for people in Mexico. It was like, we're a fund, we're managed by these board of directors, and we're kind of like this independent thing. And so it is really interesting how was never really the right to housing kind of vehicle that people wanted it to be. I don't know.
And that's true. Although,
Go ahead.
I mean, just one sort of something that I would note is that I think Infonavit has always had an identity crisis. And I mean, I'm not sure how much it still does, I think it does. It still does. But I remember like carrying some of my interviews, and a lot of Infonavit officials would argue that independency, and at the same time, like you would see the president's picture like behind them,
Sure.
right?
Yeah.
And on the other hand, an important change that I do think happened is that in comparison to other areas, like I don't know, like teachers unions, like other unions, I would argue that the unions that have been involved with Infonavit have never been that strong, or that influential, or that interested. And in the 2000s, especially, I would say that really the sector that has had the most influence, it's private developers, and so that sure. Like that part, yeah.
But I mean, you hear, nowadays the union part of Infonavit is negligible, I think. But I mean, you hear these stories from the 70s. I mean, it's and we'll show pictures for the students, like of the cool multifamiliares projects that Infonavit financed back in the 60s and the 70s. I mean, I think that the criticism of that Infonavit was that the unions were too powerful. And so you would get like a neighborhood built with financing from this fund, but only teachers could. It was like the teacher's neighborhood or the electrician's neighborhood or the CFE neighborhood. And so like, I mean, the criticisms of the old model were twofold. Like it was captured by union clientelism, and like not all people that paid in could actually get their housing benefits back. And also that it was just too limited in its impact, right? It was just not not subsidizing or financing enough housing, given the need for housing, right? And so then this change that like, well, let's just make it a bank and let's make it grow 100 times, right? And fund the construction of tons of houses was like a very conscious effort. And these like the newer directors were like, yeah, you know, maybe some of the new houses are terribly built, but like we built a lot of them.
Right. Yeah. No, for sure. That was the mentality, that growth mentality, totally. And maybe that was the model.
I was thinking, so I mean, in that sense, like this contrast between building a lot of houses versus like quality of housing. I mean, maybe can you talk a little bit about like how most people in Mexico got access to housing, you know, before the year 2000, let's say?
Right. Yeah, no, I mean, most housing was self-built, right? And that changed. And there's not a lot of clear data, but I would guess that that's returned a bit to be the case. In that 2000s, it was not the case. Like there was a turning point when like Infonavit financed housing, and yeah, it was sort of like the primary way in which housing was being built. Before that, of course, and informal settlements and housing were really prevalent, especially in the 60s and 70s when, when really urban like cities were growing very quickly.
Right.
But yeah, so that sort of shifted very rapidly in the 2000s.
I mean, and what are the pros and cons of custom built bespoke houses that you have to manage the production of yourself?
Yeah. No, I lost my train of thought a little bit. Yeah, no. So in terms of the quality, so I think the social housing projects, in comparison, for instance, to the ones that have been here in the US, are really interesting because now they're really in core areas of I mean, compared to these peripheries that were developed in the 2000s.
Right.
And so in that regards, they do provide, and they're multifamily housing projects that I would say are much more successful than what sort of Fruit IGO and what we know here in the US, right? So that was definitely a plus. Self-built housing also has a lot of issues, of course, because if people, there's the issue of scale, right? And second, and this is something that I think different administrations have supported differently depending on their political ideology and agenda. Supposedly, they're trying to support self-built housing a little bit more now, and that's something that Mexican scholars have always pushed for.
Yeah.
Right. Support the efforts of people building their own housing.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, and it's also important to note, like, I think a lot of, when we're going to have a whole week on self-built housing, and we're going to look at South Africa and I think Indonesia, but I think, you know, a lot of times it's actually not the family themselves that's building it, right? They're saving up and then they're hiring people to build it. So we call it self-built because it's like they're managing the production of the house, but they're not necessarily building it themselves. So, but it is like a very time-consuming process that takes a long time, right? So over many years, you're slowly adding on and like saving up and adding on. So, you know, this idea of a loan and the purchase of a built house, of an already built house from a developer that built it, is like the timing of consumption changes very much, right? And so there's this idea that, you know, finance can provide people with a finished house when they're young and, you know, have need, rather than like slowly building up over time. But, you know, it can be very risky, right? So I think that's another big advantage of the self-built housing model, is that you don't get a big loan for it, so it's, you don't get kicked out necessarily. And on that note, I mean, I guess the question about finance and financialization is important. So you've been doing research on financialization, I guess, and this is like a bigger research area now for housing scholars. Maybe can you talk a little bit about kind of the field of financialization of housing studies?
Right. Yeah. No. I'll and just very briefly on like our previous topic, I'll just quickly note that another of the issues that Mexican housing policy has always had, I think, it's not being able to diversify its strategies. Because although a lot of people advocate for self-help, I would say that rehabilitation, like microloans for rehab, are really important. Yeah. And we've never supported them enough. Rental housing, it's also another big thing that we've never really supported much. So that's that. But and then in terms of,
before we go to financialization, yeah, I mean, I think you're right. And I think the new Infonavit has like Mejoravit and stuff, and they're trying to do more lending around home improvement stuff. But in some of the other conversations, I think that I've had like with people in Europe, the importance of rental housing has come up, and especially in terms of like mobility. And I think that's, you know, on this like pros and cons of homeownership policies is something about mobility, right? Like you have the stability, like you're not going to get evicted from this house you own, but if a job opens up in another city or in another part of town, it's harder to move, right?
Right. And that's, I think, a case that might be a little bit more applicable to developed countries, because you have like a bigger, larger middle class that's more mobile. And in Mexico, you don't necessarily have that. On the other hand, however, and this might transition as well in the to the topic of financialization, for better or worse, you do have a lot of families that are just not, and this is an issue here in the US increasingly as well, I think, that are just not able to get into the burden that a mortgage represents, right? Especially under the conditions that they were given, right? In the 2000s.
Yeah, no,
and so that's really, yeah.
You mentioned like the subprime lending stuff is like, you know, this is the challenge for lower income households, or households especially with unstable incomes, where you don't have a check necessarily coming in every month. Then if you have a mortgage, you know, it can be a big problem if you miss a couple months payments, right? Whereas with the self-built model, you have that low risk, but you just save up and build when you can, and there's no kind of risk of getting kicked out and losing your equity.
Right. Right, and even like a lot of researchers, one of the arguments that they made, and there's different methodologies, and not all of them line up. But generally, I think if you quantify the housing deficit in Mexico, it's been argued that most of the shortage, what we call the shortage, you can address with rehab efforts.
Yep.
Not by building new housing. And
Right.
so in that regards, I think Mexico City's government a few years back in the 2000s actually offers both negative and positive examples of how to do rehab, because I think they did do a good job in some areas, and then missed some other opportunities. I think, yeah.
And were those through,
that's a little bit of a different conversation.
Through loans to families or through like government projects?
So both. So in the 2000s, and I think it's a little bit related to the conversation of urban growth boundaries and densification policies. I think that's when it failed, because it was occurring in the 2000s, sort of unprecedented resources to housing rehab efforts and densification efforts for low-income housing at the urban core. So I think that was really laudable, but they also had the Bando Dos, which was the urban growth boundary, and without sort of regulatory mechanisms, sort of land price increases were crazy. And also we know that in Estado de Mexico, with a different sort of political administration, a lot of housing was being built in the periphery. So those were the two main issues, I think.
Yeah. Yeah, and I'm going to sign the LA Times thing about all the problems associated with the new housing developments built with Infonavit financing. And maybe I was thinking City of God. Have you seen City of God, that Brazilian movie? I mean, that's kind of like similar to what happened in a lot of places in Mexico. I guess, and so like shifting to the financialization thing, I think one interesting way to look at the history of the housing policy reforms around Infonavit and the Sofoles and Sociedad Hipotecaria Federal, right? So there was like in the 80s and 90s, there was this idea that Mexican housing finance would eventually be like the US. Like, I feel like they had that in their mind. Like, we're going to have securitization, we're going to have mortgage-backed securities, we're going to have like these federal agencies like Sociedad Hipotecaria Federal is going to be like a Fannie Mae. But it like very much didn't really work out like that.
Yeah, I mean,
you think I'm more or less telling that story right?
I think you are, and I think the parallels and the difference are both interesting, and I think there's both parallels and differences between the two systems. I think government intervention, it's always sort of a fluctuating thing, and especially around financialization and around sort of what a lot of people call neoliberal policies. So on the one hand, there's sort of the conception that a neoliberal model may be a perfect free market system, and that's never the case. I think that's a utopia that never happens, right?
There's no such thing as a free market.
Right, and I mean, I would
structured by laws, right? I mean, there's not like a natural state of market without legal structures.
Right. So I think that's a really important sort of thing to always establish. Like, it's still sort of like a political and a governance system and structure. And so I think that has a lot to do with the differences between the US and the Mexican case, because the federal government has always sort of been very involved in housing and urban development policy decisions. So contrary to the US, I think local governments always get left out of a lot of important conversations.
Right.
And so it's a lot more top down. States, I think, also have a lot of leverage in decision making. So I think that leads to a different result, right, in the Mexican context and in the US context. But I guess sort of trying to finally land into the concept of financialization, I'll try to really sort of succinctly paraphrase Albers, who I think it's sort of the one of the main scholars or persons that has sort of theorized upon this concept. It's really when you have financial actors or institution having very considerable influence in sort of like the restructuring and transformation of policies, development patterns, and even so because sometimes we talk about the financialization of governments, sometimes we talk about the financialization of firms. Mm-hmm. And we can also even talk about the financialization of households, right? Like, how are we turning them like from citizens not only to consumers, but sort of into, like, in very crude terms, what's been called sort of cash cows, right? Mm-hmm. When you're like really extracting wealth rather than helping them to sort of generate wealth, which is a lot of the argument that has always been used for promoting home ownership. So I think, simply put, I would sort of frame it like that.
Right. And I mean, yeah, I think the Mexican case is interesting in that respect because of the role of Infonavit being so large. I mean, I don't think we've mentioned yet that, like, so this federal agency is like 70% or 80% of mortgage lending, right? So that's very different from the US, where, like, even though the federal government plays a very big role, like, in supporting banks, it's private banks that are doing the lending, and then institutional investors holding on to the mortgages. In Mexico, it's actually a quasi-governmental agency running most of the system. So I guess right. Is that still financialization, even if it's a government agency doing it?
So whether it's financialization, I would argue yes, mm-hmm. But also the implications, I think, are the most important part. Mm-hmm. And I think it's really related to sort of the argument that I just made in terms of like wealth extraction, because mm-hmm. So on the one hand, like you mentioned, Infonavit grew tremendously, but not only nationally, not only at a national level, it became, I think, the third largest mortgage company at some point in the 2000s, like mm-hmm. globally. So that sort of just gives you an idea of how massive it became. I would argue that the reason why financialization comes into play, it's because institutions like the World Bank, the IMF, were one, able to dictate a lot of the functioning, or the functioning of the institute. Mm-hmm. Second, on the part of the argument for wealth extraction, the main like resources or funding from Infonavit comes from workers' contribution. So like, actually, if you think about sort of democratic decision making, if the funding is really coming primarily from households mm-hmm. or workers, mm-hmm. they should be able to have more of a say in terms of like at least how they live, mm-hmm. but even how their cities develop, if they're having such an influence through right. their resources. And so it's a 5% of their earnings. It's also loan recovery, and but then financial institutions also started entering in the financial schemes of not only Infonavit but Sofoles, mm-hmm. Sociedad Hipotecaria Federal. And so although Infonavit is really a central player, there's a lot of, like, many other pieces that are coming into play right. to sort of build that housing model.
Yeah, although, I mean, I think that like I sort of was saying before, I think the I mean, you're right about the World Bank's role in the whole reorganization of the housing finance sector in Mexico. They were always, they gave a number of big loans to support that process of reorganization. I will also just note though, like the federal government was really excited about it. I mean, like Salinas government, and like it wasn't just the World Bank like telling them what to do. They were like the people, the elites running the country were like happy to go along with it, right? I think I might have frozen. Can you hear me? Oh, you're back. Did I freeze? Can you hear me? Oh, you're on mute. Mudo. Ah, weird. Huh. Oh, wait, I can ask you to unmute? No worries. Can you hear me though? Ah, there you go. No worries at all. We're gonna edit. I got
now,
from
and now I'm not being able to listen to you. Let me check if. Can you talk again?
Yeah. Testing. No. No se oye.
We could start. Can you try
Yeah.
again?
Can you hear me? No.
I can hear you now.
Oh.
Yeah.
Great.
Perfect. I'm really sorry. I forgot to change my settings. So yeah.
Not a problem at all. I'm gonna edit these things. And I'm gonna put like pictures. My dream is that I'm gonna like put cool pictures about the things, like of the things I'm talking about with people. So we'll see if I get that far.
Perfect.
But yeah, so I was saying that like about the World Bank, right. So you were right. I think you're right to say the World Bank played a very important role in the reorganization of Mexico's housing finance system. They had a bunch of loans that supported it, and they gave much money to the government in order for them to change things. But like Salinas people and like the federal government, the president in the 80s and stuff, like I think they were excited about it too, because a lot of the privatization stuff like involved them selling things to their friends for really cheap and like stealing from the country. So it was like in collaboration with the elite of Mexico, right?
But that's part of the argument, and like why political economy is so interesting and important to study from my point of view, because it's never, like we said, it's never just the free market. It's
right.
I mean, it's always a governance structure, and like I think it's a little bit related to what I mentioned that happened in Argentina under Macri's government. It's always the decision of a certain administration to take a certain route.
Yeah.
Like that's there's always influence in that regard.
And then the interesting thing with Infonavit, I think, is like, you know, the idea of having these private sector banks, like private sector mortgage thrifts, which were these Sofolo things. Like the idea was that Mexico would have a much more privatized system, but I think that Infonavit was just so big that those other, like, it was too competitive, right? Because it was this big behemoth of a financial entity that had this cash flow of, like you said, the 5% of every salaried worker in the country had to pay 5% to this fund. So they just like had all this money guaranteed, and that like the private sector couldn't actually compete with it. And so it's like this interesting case of like a wannabe neoliberal free market system that's like actually the main thing is like a quasi-governmental agency, and like the free market ideal can't be realized because of this government agency. I don't know if you agree with that perspective.
I mean, I agree partially. Going back to the same thing, you
right.
always need political structures to support financial ones.
Mm-hmm.
But also, I would say that perhaps if like we don't only need to focus on the financialization of Infonavit itself, but we also have to focus on the financialization of development companies, for instance. That's a really important one, and the financialization of households, because
You mean like housing developers?
Right.
Yeah.
Because on the one hand, we had Infonavit supporting this model financially.
Mm-hmm.
On the other hand, there were a lot of co-financing mechanisms put in place. So people were actually able to also use their Infonavit credit to finance with private banks or Sofoles. And Sofoles actually became larger than many banks for a little period when they were unregulated. Then they died because there were a lot of irresponsible decisions taken by developers as well. But they entered to sort of Wall Street, and they had that sort of push to grow, which like you cannot grow indefinitely forever.
Right.
That's just not, and so they had a lot of leverage problems, and that led to their demise.
Yeah.
Right.
Cool. I want to talk about homeownership policy and the ideas kind of behind it a little bit. And there's this idea that I'm going to bring up in the class about like humans wanting to own. I mean, so like I watched It's a Wonderful Life, a little bit of it the other day, and there's this line in it that's like, it's just like an inherent human desire to like own your house. And it's like such an America 1950s kind of thing. But in Mexico, there's this idea of patrimonio. And so I think that's a little bit similar. So maybe like, what does patrimonio mean? And do you think like there is some kind of like human desire to own your home?
Yeah, I mean, I would argue that that's not innate. It's more ideological. Right? Like certain countries, like the populations of different countries will have different views on this.
Right.
And like Europe might be a relatively good example. At the end of the day, I would say that what we really want is to have a roof like over our heads. That's just there.
That is an innate desire.
So in that, right. And so but of course, I mean, everyone wants to have stability. That's what I would argue, more than home ownership.
Right.
Although, of course, I mean, society and sometimes governments will sometimes push an idea until you're convinced that that's the only, and that's the case here in the U.S., right? I mean, and that's why home ownership, I think it's so ingrained in our psyche. But so the idea of patrimonio is one, but I would also just very quickly throw out a word that's used a lot in Mexico, which is called endrogarse. And that's used when people get into debt, right? Like that's the conception that people have of that, that you're like sort of drugging yourself, because it's something that creates a dependency, and that they sort of know that they might not be able to get out of it, and that debt will continue to grow. Yeah. And I mean, I don't know if it's a perfect analogy. It's just sort of something that's a popular just saying in Mexican culture, right? And so there you have that contradiction, I think, as well, or that tension. I talk about tensions a lot.
Yeah. I think that's the right way to think about it. It's not that something exists or not, but there's just different forces. And do you think Mexican society is changing? I mean, like the availability of financing beyond for houses, for cars, and for, Electra, like refrigerator on loan kind of things. I mean, this really boomed in the last 20 years. Do you think Mexican society is changing, like with respect to like attitudes towards getting into debt?
Yeah, I would say not as rapidly as here in the US, but again, like I think the US is something that we always aim to copy in one way or another, and that we aspire to in terms of just having more things, right? And so I think we're going that direction, or at least we were going into that direction.
Yeah, I remember that one of the, like you had mentioned, talking about communal ownership systems.
Hmm.
And I think that's a little bit related because, unfortunately, and I hope I'm wrong, but I don't really see in the short term, at least a lot of interest or future in that regard in the Mexican case. I even see a little bit more um, uh, possibilities here in the US with sort of CLTs, for instance. Like, I think that community land trusts, like, they're really gaining a little bit more support, a little bit more popularity. And
Right.
I don't see that happening in the Mexican case. We sort of like went the opposite direction with the privatization of ejido lands, and
Yeah.
yeah.
Right. Interesting. Yeah, I mean, and with the patrimonio thing, I think what I hear a lot from my friends and my wife's family is like this idea that it's a more of a building an inheritance for your family rather than like making money, right? So, my wife's uncle will always say like, oh, Americans are just like the only thing you think about when you think about housing is like, can I sell it for a lot of money and like buy another one that's bigger and like have like this growth mentality in terms of housing rather than like like a long-term preservation kind of thing. I don't know if
Right.
you would agree or not.
I mean, yes, to a certain degree, yes. And this reminds me a little bit of like the Soto's argument, because like I think that mentality has been a little bit more imposed than like sort of originated
Hmm.
perhaps from
Yeah.
the people, because I do remember that when the vacancy issue started to sort of gain attention, one of the first arguments that was made by sort of supporters of the housing development system was, well, if people are not inhabiting their houses, it's still sort of, it's
Right.
it's for them to like probably rent or sell. But that ended up not being the case, because like you really don't have a market either to rent, like in these sort of like super marginalized peripheries,
Hmm.
that lack infrastructure and services, even basic services sometimes,
Right.
that are having these vacancy and abandonment issues, crime. Like it's just, I don't think it's an asset, right? It
Yeah.
hasn't been an asset for families.
They're not they're hard to sell and they're not increasing in value. So it's not
Right,
it's not building equity.
right.
Uh,
Equity is a super important thing in the Mexican context. Really, in the 2000s, people were not building equity at all. Like
mhm.
they were paying interest and fees
Yeah.
at the beginning of their loans, and they were paying more that their housing was worth. So yeah, that's an important
Right.
point.
Yeah, and I think one of the things that I mean, it's interesting because one of the things that I'm going to emphasize in this class is like this idea of investing in real estate or investing in housing because you don't have any other options. And like in a place like Germany where the social safety net is very big and helpful, right? You have a pension, you have stability in retirement. You don't need to like build up this savings in a house, or you can even save in banks, right? So like in many countries though, this interest rates in banks are very low, or like banks are, not necessarily stable. And so people invest in land or real estate because it's like the long-term asset that you can invest in. So it's interesting. I mean, in the context of Mexico, I think a lot of people do like, invest by buying middle class families like buy a plot or buy an apartment or something if they can as like a long-term investment strategy. But at the same time, there's all these neighborhoods where people are owning houses that have no value almost. It's kind of a strange contrast.
Right, because that's what people are able to access.
Hmm.
Uh, it's it's I mean, sort of like the least prime
Yeah.
that you can get, right? Like I see a little bit of that analogy with developers in the 2000s. Like
Hmm.
they were actually sort of buying these huge pieces of land for really cheap
Hmm.
because they knew that they would be able to turn a profit. Um, but not families. I yeah, at least not the sort of bulk of families.
No,
in
yeah,
Mexico.
no, right. Okay, so last topic would be just the idea of the right to housing. I think is interesting, and like I hear, there's a lot of discussion of that idea in the U.S. The U.S. famously at the Habitat conferences always says like, we will not support the right to housing. But I wonder what you think about, like, in terms of something to learn from Mexico's experience around. So there is a constitutional right to housing, but many people have very poor housing conditions. So like, do you think it's something that advocates in the U.S. should fight for, or kind of what can we learn from Mexico's experience in this area?
Well, that's a tough one, but I do think that, and I think that there's an understanding and even a conversation here in the U.S. about that as well.
Mhm.
Even though in sort of developing countries, this is probably taken to an extreme. Like, a law doesn't mean everything, right? It's about implementation.
Yeah.
And so that has definitely been the case in Mexico. And like, for better or for worse, also, like, political will, I think, is everything. Because although, of course, political will can be pushed through civic society, right? And these groups to make sure that that policy implementation, well, first that we craft good policies, but then that they're implemented and overseen correctly. This is actually, I think, an interesting conversation with Rena.
Yeah, so that was good
oversight.
segue. So California has this law.
Yeah, even here, first world, you don't always get implementation,
Right.
perfect implementation, right?
Yeah. So do you think it should? So I mean, I agree with everything you say. I guess, like, if a advocacy group said, like, where should we spend our energy on, like, adopting a constitutional right to housing, or fighting to increase the amount of subsidies the low-income housing tax credit is able to give to build affordable housing or something. I mean, I wonder where you would fall on that.
Right. I mean, on the one hand, I don't feel completely prepared to give advice to advocates who are doing amazing work.
Right.
But from what I've gathered, I think actually shifting, and I think this is happening already just because of the tremendous housing pressures that exist here in the US. But changing the mindset, I think it's important. And so I don't know if pushing for a constitutional right to housing would help that. In the sense of that sort of like so entrenched opposing view to the right to housing here in the US, right? Like, housing, it's not a right, it's private property.
Yeah.
Like, private property, it's a right, right? And so that, like, if you can push for that shift, I think that's important, because ultimately you would also get or not get the support of constituents, right? Like, that's a struggle even here in California, right? With all of the props that didn't pass because there's still not that support. So I think both things have to happen, right? Like, advocates also need to be pragmatic in terms of what they push for. And sometimes it's important to just push for something concrete and a policy that will shift things, right? So
yeah,